Less than 6 hours. As this is being recorded, that's how close Canada and the United States are to a 50% tariff deadline that has already been delayed twice. Dominic LeBlanc and Jameson Greer sat across from each other in Washington for a meeting Thursday that ran more than 3 hours, and LeBlanc walked out telling reporters the two sides were very close to a final agreement. Trump, asked about the state of play, called the talks moving along. Multiple sources briefed CTV News that reductions in aluminum, steel, and auto tariffs are locked in, but questions still linger, as of this recording, on two of the most politically explosive files in the entire negotiation: softwood lumber and agriculture. This is a live, still unfolding story, and by the time you're watching this, the outcome may already be public in a way it wasn't at the moment this was written. The deadline is midnight tonight, Saturday, and every clock in Ottawa and Washington is currently running down toward it. And if you want to understand how Ottawa got from the brink of a 50% tariff wall to a framework that a senior Canadian official privately called a very good deal for Canada, you have to go back to the moment this fight actually started. Because the story of this deal isn't about Trump beating Carney into submission. It's about Carney figuring out, slowly and expensively, how to take back the one thing Trump thought he already owned: leverage. Rewind to February 1st, 2025. Donald Trump signs an order imposing sweeping tariffs on Canadian goods, 25% on most imports, 10% on Canadian energy. The stated justification, repeated over and over in Trump's public statements and social media posts, was fentanyl trafficking across the northern border, a claim Canadian officials disputed, given that less than 1% of fentanyl seized at U.S. ports of entry originates from Canada, according to U.S. Customs and Border Protection's own data. Ottawa didn't fold. Canada hit back with retaliatory tariffs on $30 billion of American goods, a number that ballooned to $155 billion within 3 weeks as the fight escalated. This wasn't Mark Carney's fight to inherit yet. Justin Trudeau was still Prime Minister when the first shots were fired. Carney didn't take office until March 2025, walking straight into a trade war that was already reshaping the Canadian economy, rattling cross-border supply chains, and forcing both federal and provincial governments to roll out emergency support for exposed industries. Here's the thing: people forget about leverage. It isn't a fixed quantity. It's not a pile of chips sitting on a table that one side simply grabs. Leverage in a negotiation like this one is built, spent, rebuilt, and sometimes handed away entirely by mistake. And for the first several months of Carney's tenure, Canada was doing plenty of handing away. In June 2025, Trump found a new lever: Canada's digital services tax, a 3% levy on revenue that companies like Amazon, Google, Meta, Uber, and Airbnb generated from Canadian users, retroactive all the way back to 2022. The Trump administration called it, in the president's own words on social media, a direct and blatant attack on American technology companies. On Friday, June 27th, Trump didn't just threaten a tariff response, he terminated the trade talks outright. Full stop. No negotiation, no countdown clock, just done. And within 72 hours, Ottawa blinked. Late on Sunday, June 29th, Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne announced Canada would rescind the DST entirely, in the government's words, in anticipation of a mutually beneficial comprehensive trade arrangement. The White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, didn't mince words about what had just happened. Prime Minister Mark Carney in Canada caved to President Trump in the United States of America, she told reporters. Even some Canadian commentary agreed. One technology journalist told Al Jazeera the climb down showed Trump that Canada could, in her words, be pushed around. That was the low point. If you were tracking this story in real time in the summer of 2025, this is the moment you'd have written the headline, "Trump wins." Canada had surrendered a domestic tax policy, one it had every sovereign right to implement, in exchange for nothing more than a promise to keep talking. No tariff relief, no signed deal, just talks resuming toward a July 21st target that, as it turned out, would also come and go without an agreement. By late July 2025, Trump was publicly floating a 35% blanket tariff on Canadian goods, not covered by the existing trade agreement, delivered in a letter posted to Truth Social. There will be no tariff if Canada or companies within your country decide to manufacture product within the United States, the letter read, according to CBC News. Carney's response at the time was measured, almost defiant in its patience. Negotiations were in an intense phase, he told reporters in Prince Edward Island, and Canada would take as long as necessary, but no longer, to land a deal on the right terms, not just any terms. That phrase, also in the right terms, not just any terms, is worth sitting with because it's the thread that runs through everything Carney did differently over the next 13 months. Ottawa is a city that has spent the better part of 2 years living inside this negotiation. And if you talk to trade officials there, they'll tell you the shift in strategy happened quietly, without a press conference, sometime around the fall of 2025. Instead of only playing defense, responding to Trump's tariff threats with retaliatory tariffs, which Canada had already started unwinding by autumn 2025 as a goodwill gesture, Carney's government started looking for something to offer Trump that Trump actually wanted for its own sake, not as an exchange for tariff relief, but as a genuine point of alignment. They found it in a 16-year-old pipeline. On October 7th, 2025, during a White House meeting, Carney raised with Trump the possibility of reviving the Keystone XL pipeline, the roughly 1,900-kilometer project, designed to carry up to 830,000 barrels of Alberta crude a day down to Gulf Coast refineries. This was a pipeline with a long, bitter history. Approved in 2010, blocked by the Obama administration, revived by Trump in his first term, and killed again by Joe Biden in 2021 when he canceled its border crossing permit on his first day in office. The company behind it, South Bow, had publicly said it had moved on. But according to a government source who spoke to CBC News, Carney linked the idea of energy cooperation directly to Canada's 50% steel and aluminum tariffs. And Trump, according to multiple sources briefed on the meeting, including reporting from Reuters and Bloomberg, was very receptive. Reuters reported that Carney asked Trump directly whether he'd be interested if the project came back with Canadian government support behind it. It wasn't a concession, it was a pitch. And pitches, unlike concessions, come with conditions attached. This is the move that separates leverage from surrender. When Canada rescinded the digital services tax in June, it got nothing tangible in return, just the resumption of talks that had already stalled twice before. But when Carney floated Keystone XL in October, he wasn't giving something away for free. He was offering Trump a project the American president had publicly wanted revived since February 2025. Trump himself had posted about wanting Keystone XL awoken from the grave, and tying that offer explicitly to movement on the tariffs hurting Alberta's steel and aluminum sector. Trump got a chance to claim a symbolic energy win he'd been chasing since his first term. Carney got a formal instruction from both leaders to their teams to pursue priority files on steel, aluminum, and energy, according to Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc. It was a small thing in the scope of a trade war worth tens of billions of dollars. But it was Canada, for the first time in this fight, dictating what got linked to what. Around the same time, a separate and much bigger shift was happening in Washington that had nothing to do with anything Carney did personally. But that fundamentally changed the leverage math anyway. Early in 2026, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down several of Trump's sweeping tariffs, the ones imposed under emergency powers legislation known as the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, in a case that reached the nation's highest court after lower courts had already found the administration's use of that law legally shaky. Reuters and multiple legal outlets covered the ruling extensively. Trump's tariff authority, it turned out, was not the unlimited executive weapon it had appeared to be in February 2025. Some of the tariffs Trump had used to threaten Canada were built on legal sand. That mattered enormously heading into the summer of 2026, because it meant every new tariff threat Trump made afterward, including the 50% Section 338 tariffs that would define the August showdown, had to be built on different, narrower legal authority, subject to its own scrutiny. By the summer of 2026, Carney had also been quietly running a second track that rarely made headlines outside Ottawa: diversification, trips to Europe to deepen economic ties, conversations about Indo-Pacific trade partnerships, a public message to Canadians, repeated by Carney at multiple points, including comments to reporters in Ottawa reported by Global News, that the country needed to focus on what we can control and build up its own economy rather than treat a deal with Washington as the only path forward. This is a subtle form of leverage that doesn't show up in any single headline. The less economically dependent Canada appears on any single deal with the United States, the less pressure Ottawa faces to accept bad terms just to end the uncertainty. It's a slow burn strategy, not a dramatic one. But trade negotiators will tell you slow burn strategies are usually the ones that actually move outcomes, because they change what happens if talks fail. And what happens if talks fail is, ultimately, the thing that determines what either side will accept. There's one more piece of this puzzle that matters enormously, and it's the piece that turned elbows up from a slogan into an actual governing strategy. The phrase itself, elbows up, was coined by Carney during the federal election campaign, according to reporting compiled around the CUSMA review, to describe an assertive, defensive negotiating posture meant to protect Canadian interests rather than simply absorb whatever Washington proposed. It became shorthand for a whole approach: buy Canadian where possible, diversify trade where possible, and don't treat every American demand as non-negotiable. That posture was tested directly on July 1st, 2026, the 6th anniversary of CUSMA's entry into force and the date written into the agreement itself under Article 34. 7, for a mandatory joint review among Canada, the United States, and Mexico. Ahead of that date, Carney's government had already stood up an advisory committee on Canada-U, Hess Economic Relations back in April of 2026, chaired by Dominic LeBlanc, specifically to sharpen Ottawa's strategic approach heading into the review. And ahead of the review, polling from Abacus data found 69% of Canadians wanted Ottawa to hold firm in the CUSMA negotiations, even if it meant living with prolonged uncertainty, with only 20% favoring quick compromises. A mandate, effectively, for exactly the slow, leverage-building approach Carney had been pursuing since the Keystone conversation the previous October. Here's what actually happened on July 1st. The United States, through USTR Ambassador Jameson Greer's own official statement, said it did not agree to renew CUSMA in its current form. In Greer's words, released by the USTR press office, the USMCA is not renewed, though the agreement remains legally in force pending resolution of what the U.S. called the deal's shortcomings and ongoing trade deficits. That sounds, on its face, like a major setback, and headlines in the days after certainly read that way. But the fine print, confirmed by the Bank of Canada's own January 2026 Monetary Policy Report and by RBC Economics' analysis of the review, matters just as much as the top-line outcome. CUSMA does not automatically expire when a joint review fails to produce an extension. It simply continues under its original term through 2036, with reviews now happening annually instead of once every 6 years, and virtually all of Canada's tariff-free trade protections under the agreement. RBC estimated roughly 90% of Canadian exports to the U.S. remained duty-free specifically because of CUSMA stayed intact. In other words, the U.S. walked right up to the edge of blowing up the entire framework and then, functionally, didn't. That non-event, arriving 7 weeks before the August tariff showdown, is itself part of the leverage story. It confirmed that even Washington's own trade representative recognized dismantling CUSMA outright carried costs the administration wasn't prepared to absorb, which meant every subsequent threat, including the 50% Section 338 tariffs in August, was being made by a White House that had just demonstrated in July that it valued a bruised version of the existing framework over no framework at all. None of this made the underlying pain disappear. Throughout late 2025 and into 2026, Canadian industries kept absorbing real damage, and nowhere was that more visible than in Ontario's auto belt. Back in March 2025, before any of this leverage rebuilding had really begun, Carney, then still campaigning, stood at the Ambassador Bridge in Windsor, the crossing that shuttles millions of dollars in goods between Ontario and Michigan every single day, and unveiled a $2 billion strategic response fund for the auto sector just hours before Trump announced a 25% tariff on all vehicles not built in the United States. That was the opening act. By January 2026, the consequences were landing in real paychecks. General Motors cut roughly 1,200 jobs at its Oshawa assembly plant, trimming a third production shift, as the company simultaneously added temporary jobs at its Fort Wayne, Indiana facility instead, a direct, visible transfer of auto production south of the border. Unifor Local 222. President Jeff Gray told CBC News his members had high hopes that Carney would deliver a trade deal quickly, adding bluntly, "We're in a situation right now where it's critical, and we're not going to sit around any longer." Flavio Volpe, president of the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association, described anxiety rippling through Canadian suppliers from Oshawa to Windsor. Ontario Premier Doug Ford, standing alongside frustrated auto workers, pressed Carney directly to do more, while the province rolled out what it calls power centres, Protect Ontario Workers' Employment Response Centres, which had already helped close to 15,000 laid-off workers with transition support and retraining by early 2026, funded jointly through a Canada-Ontario tariff response initiative. Home renovation contractors in border regions reported fewer clients. Businesses along the Canada-US border described being, in the words of one global news segment, hammered by Trump tariffs and rhetoric. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre accused Carney's government of bending over backwards in the negotiations, a charge that stuck politically even as trade officials insisted progress was being made behind closed doors. This is the honest complication in the Carney took his leverage back narrative. It wasn't a clean, triumphant reversal. It was messy, slow, and expensive, measured in real layoffs in Oshawa and Windsor, not just in press releases out of Ottawa. And reasonable people in Ontario and across Canada disagreed, and still disagree, about whether the trade-offs on the table by August 2026 were worth what auto workers and their communities had already absorbed to get there. Then came August 2026, and the whole relationship came to a head one more time. On August 17th, Trump escalated again, threatening 50% tariffs on $20 billion of Canadian goods, hockey sticks, cement, and a range of other products, set to take effect just after midnight on August 19th, unless negotiators found a way out. CTV News political commentator Scott Reed described contradictory signals coming out of a Monday meeting between Carney and Trump that week, noting Carney had, for what Reed called the first time, spoken openly about the need to prepare for all eventualities. diplomatic language that Reid read as code for Canada quietly readying a fresh round of counter tariffs if the 50% levy actually landed. 2 days before that 50% deadline, on August 16th and 17th, the outlines of a very different kind of deal started leaking out through the Globe and Mail's Washington bureau. Trump would lower tariffs on Canadian autos, steel, aluminum, and forest products. In exchange, Canada would make concessions on alcohol, dairy, and government procurement rules, and Trump would drop the threatened new tariffs on electronics, alcohol, and dairy that were set to hit August 19th. This was the shape of the trade Carney had been steering toward since that Keystone XL conversation 10 months earlier. Give ground on specific, negotiable items, provincial liquor store shelves, procurement access, in exchange for relief on the tariffs actually crushing Canadian industry. Then, on the day itself, August 19th, with the deadline bearing down, Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc and USTR Jameson Greer announced in Washington that a deal had been struck to break the deadlock. Carney posted his congratulations to both negotiators, choosing his words with the same careful precision he'd used all along. Significant progress, not done deal, a signal, as one policy magazine analysis pointed out, that the agreement wasn't yet finalized. Less than 2 hours before the 50% Section 338 tariffs were due to hit, Trump postponed them again, this time to Friday, August 21st, to give lawyers and negotiators time to finish the actual text. What emerged, according to people familiar with the matter, cited by Bloomberg and confirmed independently by the Wall Street Journal, was a tentative agreement lowering U.S. tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum exports from 50% down to 25%, and cutting duties on Canadian autos from 25% down to 15%. Trump, speaking to reporters in Washington, called the deal very fair to both sides and predicted American farmers and manufacturers would benefit. In comments picked up by Al Jazeera, the Boston Globe, and multiple wire services, Trump claimed the agreement would mean, in his words, tariffs on American farm goods entering Canada being totally eviscerated, down to zero. On the Canadian side, LeBlanc was far more specific about the one file Ottawa had drawn an absolute line around: dairy. The Prime Minister was very clear: we need to protect supply management, LeBlanc told reporters in Washington, adding he was very confident the regime would remain entirely intact. That line traces directly back to comments Carney made in Saguenay, Quebec, on August 6th, touring an aluminum facility, where he told reporters the Liberal Party remains very loyal to supply management, a system established in the 1970s that Washington has criticized for decades as a barrier to American dairy exports, and one that carries enormous domestic political weight in dairy-heavy ridings across Quebec and Ontario. USTR Jameson Greer, for his part, said Canada and the U.S. had eliminated some of the irritants we've had over the past year, while stopping short of confirming every detail. Softwood lumber tells a messier story, and it's a useful reminder that not every file moves as cleanly as steel and autos did. Canada and the U.S. have gone without a softwood lumber agreement since 2015, an entirely separate, decade-old irritant layered on top of everything else in this fight. Carney himself has floated that any eventual deal could include some element of managed trade, quotas in plain language, on lumber exports, after British Columbia Premier David Eby told Bloomberg News that federal and provincial officials had been discussing exactly that kind of arrangement. As of Thursday's talks, CTV News reported those questions on lumber and agriculture remained unresolved, even as the steel, aluminum, and auto numbers were treated as functionally locked in. And then there's the alcohol file, which is small in dollar terms, but enormous in symbolism. 8 of Canada's 10 provinces restrict or ban U.S. alcohol on store shelves, retaliatory measures adopted in the earliest, angriest phase of this trade war, compounded by fury over Trump's repeated musing that Canada should become the 51st U.S. state. The Distilled Spirits Council estimates U.S. spirits exports to Canada have fallen more than 70% as a result. In Ontario alone, the government-run LCBO, one of the largest alcohol purchasers on the planet, used to sell nearly $1 billion Canadian in American product annually before pulling it from shelves. Carney has now asked premiers to restock it, and all of them have agreed to comply, according to CTV News reporting from this week. But here's the catch worth flagging honestly. Carney cannot actually order the provinces to do this. It's a request, not a mandate, and experts quoted in Canadian coverage this week aren't convinced Canadian consumers, many of whom embraced elbows-up boycotts as a point of pride, will rush back to buying American booze even once it's back on the shelf. So here's the actual scorecard. As best as it can be verified right now, Trump wanted Canada's leverage taken off the table entirely, a scenario where Ottawa faced tariffs with no real countermove, where Canada would, in Trump's own words from July 2025, get just a tariff, not really a negotiation. That's not what happened. Instead, over 18 months, Carney's government built alternative leverage piece by piece. A Supreme Court ruling that narrowed Trump's tariff authority, a diversification push that reduced Canada's total dependence on the US market, and a targeted offer, Keystone XL, that gave Trump something he wanted on Canadian terms, rather than under Canadian duress. By August 2026, that leverage translated into a framework where steel and aluminum tariffs came down from 50% to 25%, autos from 25% to 15%, and Canada's dairy sector, one of the most politically sensitive files in Ottawa, stayed protected rather than sacrificed. Trump, for his part, got the symbolic wins he wanted. A possible Keystone XL revival still under discussion, claims of zero tariffs for American farmers, and the ability to tell his base he'd extracted major concessions from Canada on alcohol and procurement. Both sides are calling it a win. That's usually the sign of a deal that actually landed somewhere close to the middle, which, after a trade war that started with a $155 billion retaliatory tariff list, is not nothing. Now, the honest caveats, because a story like this deserves them. First, and most importantly, as of this recording, on the day of the actual deadline, this is still not a signed, ratified agreement. It's a framework that both sides describe as nearly finished, with LeBlanc and Greer meeting again Friday morning in Washington, and less than a day left before the 50% tariffs are due to hit at midnight. Past deadlines in this negotiation, July 21st, 2025, and August 1st, 2025, among them, have come and gone without final signatures before, so nothing here should be treated as locked in until Ottawa and Washington both confirm it in writing. Second, Trump's claim of tariffs on U.S. farm goods being totally eviscerated has not been independently verified against actual treaty language, and reporting from CBC, Bloomberg, and the Boston Globe all describe key terms as still vague even after the joint framework announcement. Third, domestic critics in Canada, including Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, who has publicly urged Carney not to take a bad deal in coverage from this very week, have characterized the government's overall approach as too accommodating. And the Canadian Chamber of Commerce's own president, Candice Lang, pointed out in a public statement that an extension doesn't bring the certainty that a signed interim deal would. That's a reminder that businesses in Ottawa, Windsor, Saguenay, and communities across the country are still operating with real uncertainty until ink actually hits paper. Fourth, provincial priorities genuinely diverge here in ways that could still complicate a final signature. Quebec is focused above all on protecting dairy supply management, Ontario on its battered auto sector, and British Columbia on finally resolving the decade-plus softwood lumber standoff. And reporting this week noted provincial leaders could push back if the final text shortchanges any one of those regional priorities. And fifth, on the fentanyl justification that started this entire trade war back in February 2025, CBSA and U.S. Customs and Border Protection data have consistently shown Canada accounts for a small fraction of fentanyl seized at U.S. ports of entry compared to the southern border, a discrepancy Canadian officials have raised repeatedly throughout these negotiations, and that remains, in the framing of several sources cited here, contested. If you've made it this far, you've probably noticed this channel doesn't do the easy version of this story, the one where one side simply wins and the other loses. Real trade negotiations, the kind playing out for 18 months between Ottawa and Washington, are built on leverage that shifts month to month, court ruling to court ruling, tariff threat to tariff postponement. If that kind of detail is what you come here for, subscribing means you won't miss the next update, because Friday's finalized text could still change meaningfully from what's being reported right now, and there's a real chance the numbers in this very script get revised within days. What's genuinely striking, looking back at the full arc, is how much the story flipped. In June 2025, the narrative was Canada caving, surrendering a tax policy for nothing more than a promise to keep talking. By August 2026, the narrative from Canada's own senior officials was a very good deal for Canada. That shift didn't happen because Trump softened his approach. If anything, his tariff threats got larger, not smaller, culminating in that 50% Section 338 threat just days before the framework was announced. It happened because Carney's government stopped only reacting to Trump's leverage and started building its own through the courts, through diversification, and through offering Trump wins on Canada's own terms rather than as tribute payments to end a crisis. Whether that framework survives intact through Friday's final signatures, and whether zero tariffs for farmers holds up against the fine print, is something worth watching closely in the days ahead. For a story this fluid, if you want the confirmed final terms, the moment they're locked in, rather than the still shifting picture from this week, subscribing is genuinely the easiest way to catch that follow-up the moment it's verified. There's also a broader question sitting underneath all of this, one that goes beyond tariff percentages and pipeline politics. Is this the new normal for how Canada and the United States do business with each other? A relationship defined by recurring crises, rolling deadlines, and frameworks announced hours before disaster, rather than the kind of stable, predictable trading arrangement CUSMA was originally designed to guarantee? Grassley's warning about not letting these negotiations destroy the trilateral agreement suggests even some Republicans in Washington are uneasy about where this pattern leads if it keeps repeating every few months. If you think this cycle becomes the standard operating procedure for U.S.-Canada trade going forward, this channel will keep tracking every twist as the final legal text gets published and as whatever comes after this framework starts to take shape. That's exactly the kind of follow-through subscribing here is built for. It's worth remembering, too, that the CUSMA relationship this framework sits inside doesn't get another mandatory review until 2027, under the annual review clock that kicked in after the failed July 2026 extension. Meaning whatever gets signed in the next day or two, assuming it gets signed at all, could be the operating baseline for Canada-US trade for a full year, before either side is contractually required to revisit it again. Here's the sourcing, laid out plainly, because on a story moving this fast, transparency about where each fact came from matters as much as the facts themselves. The steel, aluminum, and auto tariff figures in this framework come from Bloomberg and Wall Street Journal reporting, citing people familiar with the matter, corroborated by a source who spoke directly to the Canadian press. The August 19th announcement details, including LeBlanc and Greer's joint statement and Carney's significant progress post, are drawn from Policy Magazine's coverage and CBC News, reporting from John Paul Tasker. The dairy supply management commitments come directly from LeBlanc's own on-record remarks to reporters in Washington, cross-referenced with Carney's August 6th comments in Saguenay, reported by the Epoch Times. The softwood lumber and alcohol restocking details are sourced to CTV News and CP24's live coverage from August 21st, along with Boston Globe reporting, citing Reuters and Associated Press staff on the ground in Washington and Ottawa. Trump's direct quotes about the deal being very fair and tariffs being eviscerated for farmers come from ABC News and Al Jazeera's wire coverage of his remarks to reporters in Washington. The Keystone XL discussions are sourced to CBC News, Reuters, Bloomberg, and the BBC, all of which independently confirmed the October 7th, 2025 meeting through sources familiar with the discussions. The digital services tax rescission is confirmed directly through Finance Canada's own June 29, 2025 press release, along with CBC, NPR, and Al Jazeera reporting on the fallout. The Supreme Court ruling on EPA tariffs and the CUSMA joint review outcome are documented through the court's own case history and USTR Ambassador Greer's official July 1st statement, respectively. The Oshawa layoff figures and union reaction come from CBC News reporting by Ethan Lang, corroborated by global news coverage of the same layoffs. What remains genuinely unverified or still in flux as of this recording? The complete legal text of the framework, the precise mechanics of the farmer tariff claim, the final outcome on softwood lumber and agriculture, and whether tonight's midnight deadline holds without yet another extension. This negotiation has missed and moved deadlines repeatedly over the past 18 months, and there's no guarantee this one is different. So here's the question worth sitting with. Did Carney actually outmaneuver Trump on trade leverage over these 18 months? Or did Canada simply get lucky with a Supreme Court ruling and a tariff threat that happened to be politically costly enough for Trump to back down from at the last minute? Or is there a third option, that in a relationship, this asymmetric leverage was always going to be a mostly symbolic word, and what actually happened is two governments finding the least damaging way to manage a fight, neither one could fully win? There's also the more immediate question, the one nobody in Ottawa or Washington can answer with certainty right now. Does tonight's midnight deadline actually hold, or does this become the third extension in a negotiation that has already blown past two? Given how this has gone since February 2025, deadline sets, deadline slips, tariffs threatened, tariffs paused, betting against another extension has not historically been the smart bet. Drop your read on it in the comments. Genuinely curious where people land on this one, especially with the final text still hours away from being locked in. If it locks in at all tonight, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.